It was supposed to be a quiet Thursday morning, the kind where the only thing I had to worry about was getting Noah fed before he started screaming loud enough to wake the whole street. I was 3 months into maternity leave, still running on broken sleep and cold coffee, and honestly grateful for any help that showed up at my door. That's what I told myself every time Claire knocked. Claire had been my best friend since our sophomore year at Ohio State. We met in a cramped biology lab, argued over a microscope slide, and somehow never stopped talking after that. She was the maid of honor at my wedding. She threw my baby shower. She was the first person, besides Mark, who held Noah when we brought him home from the hospital. So when she started coming by every morning with homemade smoothies, saying it was her way of helping me recover postpartum, I didn't think twice. I just drank them and thanked her, and felt lucky to have someone like her in my life. I should have paid closer attention. 12 years of pharmacy school and hospital rotations, and I missed what was sitting right in front of me. That Thursday started like every other one. Noah was fussing in his bouncer, Mark had already left for work, and I was still in my robe when the doorbell rang at 7:15. Claire stood on the porch holding 2 bags, one canvas tote with the smoothie container she always brought, and a smaller insulated bag she said she needed to drop off for her gym session later. She stayed maybe 10 minutes, long enough to coo over Noah and chat about a show we were both watching, then kissed my cheek and left. I set her smaller bag on the counter, meaning to text her about it. Then Noah started crying, and I forgot completely. An hour later, I reached into the canvas tote to grab my smoothie for the morning and realized something was off. The containers inside didn't have the usual labels Claire wrote in her loopy handwriting. They were plain, and tucked underneath them was a small amber glass bottle, the kind we use in compounding pharmacies, with no label at all. I stood there for a second, bottle in my hand, brain still half asleep. I unscrewed the cap and brought it close. The smell hit me before anything else. Faint, metallic, something I hadn't smelled outside of a clinical setting in years. My stomach dropped before my brain could even catch up with why. I set Noah in his crib, went back to the kitchen, and stood under the light over the sink. The powder inside the bottle was fine and off-white, clumping slightly at the edges. I touched the tiniest amount to my fingertip, rubbed it, and felt that faint graininess that doesn't belong in any protein powder or supplement I'd ever formulated. I'd worked 3 years in a hospital compounding pharmacy before Noah came. I'd handled enough restricted substances to know when something wasn't food grade. I texted Mark immediately. He called back in under a minute. I can hear his voice now, the way it shifted from casual to completely still when I described what I was looking at. He said, "Don't touch it again. Put it in a Ziploc bag. I'm calling someone." Mark worked in hospital administration. He had contacts. Within an hour, his colleague Dr. Peterson, a toxicologist he'd collaborated with on a research grant, was at our kitchen table. He looked at the bottle for exactly 45 seconds before he looked at me with an expression I recognized from years of watching doctors deliver difficult news. He wasn't panicking. That was somehow worse. "Rachel," he said carefully, "where did you say this came from?" "My best friend," I told him. "She's been bringing me smoothies every morning for almost 2 months." The silence that followed was the kind that rearranges the furniture in your brain. He sent the bottle to the hospital lab that same afternoon with a personal favor from his department. Mark stayed home. I sat on the couch with Noah in my arms and tried to think about every morning for the past 8 weeks. The fatigue I'd blamed on new motherhood. The nausea I'd chalked up to lingering hormones. The headaches I assumed were from staring at my phone during 3 a.m. feedings. I'd mentioned them to my OB at my 6-week check, and she'd said it sounded like standard postpartum exhaustion. I believed her because I wanted to. Now I sat in my living room and did the math and felt sick in a way that had nothing to do with whatever was in that bottle. Dr. Peterson called us back that evening. I remember exactly where I was standing, by the kitchen window watching the neighbor's dog bark at nothing in the yard. Mark had me on speaker and held the phone between us. The substance was thallium sulfate, a heavy metal compound, historically used in rodenticides before it was banned. Odorless, nearly tasteless, and in low repeated doses, it mimics everything from fatigue to neurological symptoms. The amount found in the bottle, distributed across daily smoothies, was consistent with a slow-dose exposure protocol. Not enough to kill quickly, enough to make someone progressively sicker over months. I gripped the counter and stared at the wall. Mark's hand found my shoulder. The next morning, I called my doctor and went in for blood work. The results came back 2 days later. elevated thallium levels. Not critical, not yet, but real. Someone had been poisoning me. Someone who came to my house every morning and smiled and held my baby and said she loved me. The person I'd known longer than I'd known my own husband. I kept turning it over, looking for a different explanation, and finding none. Claire had keys to my house. She had access to my kitchen. She had uninterrupted time with my food every single day. And she had something else, something I started piecing together as I scrolled back through the past year with fresh eyes. It started with small things. The way she lingered when Mark was home, laughed louder, touched his arm when she made a point. The time she showed up when I was out and he was alone, with some excuse about dropping something off. The comment she made at my baby shower, meant to sound like a joke, about how Mark would make such a good dad even if it hadn't been with me. I'd laughed it off. I wrote it down now. I called Mark's coworker Jenna, who'd become a friend of mine over the years. I asked her casually whether she'd ever noticed anything between Claire and Mark at company events Claire had attended. There was a long pause before Jenna said, "I didn't want to be the one to bring this to you, but yeah, she flirts with him constantly. I always thought it was weird." I sat in my car in our driveway for 20 minutes after that call. Mark didn't know. I was certain of that, not just because I trusted him, but because the math only worked if he didn't. If Claire's goal was to eventually step into my life, she needed me gone slowly, quietly, in a way that looked like illness. She needed him grieving and vulnerable, not suspicious. She'd been patient about it, methodical. That scared me more than anything. I called Detective Angela Reyes that same week through a referral from Dr. Peterson. She was a serious woman in her mid-40s who didn't waste time on pleasantries. I laid everything on the table. The bottle, the lab results, the blood work, the behavioral pattern I'd been building. She listened without interrupting and then asked me one question. "Do you want to report this now and arrest her on what we have, or do you want to catch her doing it?" I looked at Mark across the kitchen table. He nodded once. "We want to catch her," I said. Reyes moved quickly. Within 48 hours, 2 small cameras were installed in my kitchen, angled toward the counter and the blender station where Claire always worked. My phone could pull the live feed. We replaced the smoothie containers Claire had left with identical ones I filled myself, marked on the bottom with a tiny scratch so I'd know which was which, and I kept texting Claire like nothing had changed. "Good morning. Thanks for yesterday's smoothie. It was great. Can you still come Thursday?" She replied with a heart emoji and a selfie of her at the grocery store picking up ingredients. The next morning, she came at 7:20. I stayed in the living room with Noah, watching the feed on my phone. My hands were completely steady. I'd spent 3 years dispensing medication with a practiced calm, and I used every bit of it now. On the screen, Claire set her bag on the counter, pulled out the blender, and arranged the fruit and greens like she always did. Then she glanced toward the hallway. I watched her reach into the front pocket of her jacket. She pulled out a small folded paper envelope, the kind you'd get from a pharmacy or a coin collector, and she tapped a measured amount of white powder into the blender. She stirred with a spoon, rinsed the spoon in the sink, and tucked the envelope back into her pocket. Then she turned around, smiled at nothing, and kept blending. I pressed my back against the wall in the hallway and breathed. Reyes had texted me already. Got it on camera. "Stay calm. Do not confront yet." So I walked back into the kitchen, Noah on my hip, and said good morning like I hadn't just watched my best friend try to poison me for the 15th time in a row. Claire handed me the smoothie with a big smile, and I set it on the counter and said I'd have it once Noah went down for his nap. She looked at the cup for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary before she looked back at me. Every morning after that was the same ritual. She came. I watched. Reyes collected the smoothie samples. The lab confirmed thallium each time. The concentration was slowly climbing. She was getting impatient. Reyes told me that meant we were running out of time to do this cleanly. She wanted a confession on record, something that tied motive to action beyond any reasonable doubt. The footage was damning, but a good defense attorney would find angles. We needed her to say it out loud. That's when Reyes proposed the scenario. It was Mark's idea to frame it around the hospital. He said Claire would never come to our house for something like this, but a hospital room, the controlled setting of believing she'd won, that would bring her guard all the way down. The plan was simple in outline and terrifying in execution. I would be admitted to Cedar Valley under a false cardiac emergency. Reyes had a contact in the ER who agreed to run a controlled scenario. I would be in a room with monitors, pale makeup, an IV that wasn't connected to anything. The official story Claire would hear from Mark, in a voice cracking with genuine fear, was that I had collapsed and wasn't responding. I talked to Mark about it for a long time the night before. He kept his jaw tight and his voice even. But I could see what it cost him to walk through it out loud. I asked if he could do it. He said he'd do worse things than that to protect his family. The morning of, I kissed Noah in his crib while he slept and told him I'd be back before dinner. Mark drove me to the hospital. I changed into a gown, let the nurse attach the monitors, and lay back against the pillow in a private room at the end of the cardiac wing. Reyes stood in the adjoining observation space with 2 of her officers. Dr. Peterson was in the hall in case anything needed adjusting. I closed my eyes and made myself breathe slowly. Mark called Claire from the parking lot. I could hear her voice through his phone from across the room even before he put it on speaker. She answered on the second ring, breathless, like she'd been waiting for something. He told her I had collapsed that morning. He told her they weren't sure I was going to make it. He told her he didn't know what to do. Her voice went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll be right there. Don't leave her alone." She arrived in 22 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock on the wall, my eyes opened just enough to track it through my lashes. I heard her heels in the hallway, that specific clip she had when she walked fast, and then the door opened and she came in. Mark stood in the corner by the window with his face in his hands. Claire stopped just inside the door. I watched through nearly closed eyes as she looked at me, really looked, and something moved across her face that I'd never seen before. Not shock. Not grief. Something quieter and more private and completely wrong for the moment. She crossed the room slowly. She stood beside the bed and looked down at me. The monitors beeped in the flat, unvaried rhythm the nurse had programmed. My hands were still on the blanket. She reached out and touched my wrist, just for a second, and I had to concentrate so hard on not reacting that my whole body felt like stone. Then she leaned down and whispered, so low I almost didn't catch it. Finally, one word. The whole room was recording. Mark lifted his head from the window and looked at her. His voice was unsteady on purpose. She might not make it through the night, Claire. She might not wake up. Claire straightened and made a sound that was supposed to be crying. "I'm so sorry, Mark. I'm so sorry." She touched his arm the way she always did. "I'm here. Whatever you need, I'm here." He stepped back, just slightly. She was getting sicker for weeks. We couldn't figure out why. There was a pause. I felt her turn back toward me. "Maybe it was just her body," she said. "Some women don't bounce back well after having a baby." That was when I opened my eyes. She stumbled backwards so fast she hit the chair by the wall. Her face went completely white. Mark moved to my side and took my hand, and I sat up slowly, and neither of us said anything for a moment. We just looked at her. "Rachel, she shook her head. What is this?" I swung my legs over the side of the bed. "Sit down, Claire." She didn't move. Her eyes went to Mark, then back to me, then to the door. Reyes opened that door before she could take a single step toward it. 2 officers came in behind her. Claire pressed herself against the wall like she could sink into it. "Claire Lawson," Reyes said. Badge visible, voice completely flat. "You are being detained in connection with ongoing criminal poisoning of Rachel Monroe. You have the right to remain silent." Claire's mouth opened. Closed. Then she looked at me, and all the performance fell off her face at once, and what was underneath was something raw and ugly and exhausted. "You set me up," she said. "You poisoned me," I said. "For 2 months. While I was home with a newborn, my voice didn't shake. I was surprised by that. "I need to hear you say why." She laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You really want to do this here?" "Yes." Reyes nodded at her officers but stayed where she was. Claire looked at Mark. Something in her expression twisted. "You know why," she said to him, as if I weren't even in the room. "You've always known. You settled, Mark. You picked the safe option because she was there and convenient, and she fit the timeline you had in your head. And you never even looked up long enough to see what was standing right in front of you for 12 years. Mark's hand tightened around mine. He didn't answer her. She finally looked at me. "I wasn't trying to kill you fast. I just wanted you to get sick. Sick enough that he'd see what he had to carry. That he'd realize you weren't worth it." She said it like it was reasonable. Like she'd turned it over so many times in her own head that it had worn smooth. I wanted him to choose differently. I just needed time. Thallium poisoning causes permanent neurological damage, I said quietly. It causes hair loss, organ damage, paralysis. You knew that. You have a biochemistry degree. She didn't answer. You weren't just buying time, I said. You were willing to let me be disabled, or dead, with a 3-month-old at home. The silence that followed was the worst kind. Not because she denied it, because she didn't. Reyes moved then, and the officer stepped forward, and Claire let herself be turned toward the door, with her wrists being cuffed behind her like someone who'd stopped fighting something they'd already known was coming. At the door, she looked back one more time, not at Mark, not at me, just at the room, like she was memorizing it. Then she was gone. Mark sat on the edge of the hospital bed and put his face in his hands again, and this time it wasn't for show. I put my arm around his shoulders and we stayed like that for a while without saying anything. Reyes came back in after the officers left with Claire. She set a folder on the chair. Lab results, camera footage, audio, and your blood work are all going to the DA tonight. With the confession on record, she's looking at aggravated assault with a deadly substance, premeditated poisoning, and potentially attempted murder given the documented escalation of concentration. She won't be out for a long time. I nodded. I should have felt relieved. I felt mostly tired, the deep kind that doesn't go away after one night's sleep. She was your best friend, Reyes said. It wasn't a question, but it had a question in it. I thought she was, I said. I think maybe I was her best friend. That's not the same thing. Mark drove me home before noon. Noah was with my mother-in-law, and the house was quiet in that particular way that feels louder than noise. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the counter where the blender had sat. Mark had already moved it to the garage. I was glad. We picked Noah up that afternoon. My mother-in-law hugged me for a long time at the door and didn't ask questions yet, just held on. I let her. That night after Noah went down, Mark and I sat at the kitchen table with takeout containers between us and didn't talk about Claire for a while. We talked about nothing, the kind of nothing that matters more than most conversations. Whether Noah's colic was getting better, whether we should repaint the hallway, whether his sister was still coming for Thanksgiving. Normal things. I held on to every word. Eventually Mark said, "How long do you think she had it planned?" I thought about the shower she threw me. The visits with the smoothies starting almost exactly when I stopped going back to work. How she'd have known, from years of friendship and a biochemistry background, exactly what to use and exactly how slowly to dose it. A while, I said. He was quiet for a moment. I never saw it. I didn't either, I said. That's not something to feel guilty about. We're not supposed to look at our friends that way. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. Outside the window, the neighborhood was doing its ordinary evening thing, porches lighting up, a dog barking 2 houses down, someone pulling into a driveway. I watched it all and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite peace yet but was moving toward it. The trial was 4 months later. Claire entered a guilty plea 6 weeks before the scheduled date, likely on her attorney's advice after seeing the scope of what we had. The DA told me she would be sentenced to 18 years, with no possibility of parole for the first 12. When I read the message, I was sitting in the hospital parking lot, back at work part-time, and I sat there for 5 minutes before I went inside. The friends from our college group texted me carefully, not knowing what to say. A few of them said they'd had a feeling something was off with Claire for years and hadn't known how to bring it up. I didn't know what to do with that, so I thanked them and left it there. Noah started Solid Foods in December. His first reaction to sweet potato was so over-the-top offended that Mark and I laughed until we cried, and for a full minute the kitchen felt like just a kitchen again. I thought about that. How spaces carry what happens in them, and then slowly, if you let them, they start to carry new things instead. I stopped going back over the timeline in the middle of the night somewhere around March. Not because I'd made peace with what happened, exactly, but because I'd started understanding something about it that I couldn't have seen while I was still inside it. Claire had spent years cultivating closeness with me, as a way to stay close to what she wanted. Every gesture of friendship had a second layer I hadn't been looking for, because you don't look for that in someone you trust. That's not naivety, that's just how trust works. The failure wasn't mine. Some people ask me if I miss her. The person I thought she was, the one who sat with me through my worst breakup in junior year, the one who drove 4 hours to surprise me on my birthday once. I do. But that person was always partially a performance, which means what I miss is something that never quite existed. That's a specific kind of loss with no clean name for it. What I know for certain is this. I came home from that hospital room, and Noah was on his playmat reaching for a plastic lion, and Mark was heating up soup on the stove. And the whole ordinary weight of a life I'd built settled back around me like something I hadn't known I'd been holding my breath for. That's what she was trying to take. That's what didn't go anywhere. We changed the locks in January, not because we were afraid, just because some things don't need to stay the same. Noah took his first steps in April, listing dramatically toward the coffee table before catching himself, and I had my phone out fast enough to get the whole thing on video. I sent it to my mom and my in-laws and a handful of friends, and I watched it back 3 times that night after he went to sleep. This small, determined person figuring out how to move through the world. The case made the local news briefly. A pharmacist, a poisoning, a best friend. It had the shape of something people click on. I didn't do any interviews. Reyes handled the press questions with a standard statement about the successful investigation and left my name in the background where I preferred it. Mark made one comment to a reporter outside the courthouse, short and final. My family is doing well. That's all we need people to know. And we were. We genuinely were. I went back to full-time work in May. My department had covered for me longer than I had any right to ask, and coming back to the pharmacy counter, to the familiar rhythm of prescriptions and patient questions and the particular focus the job demands, felt like putting on something I'd missed wearing. My supervisor, a woman named Donna who had sent a card to the house every month I was away, said nothing when I walked in on the first day except "Your station's ready," and handed me a coffee. I nearly hugged her. Some things take longer than you expect. The way I still check the pantry before someone else has been in the kitchen. The half-second of hesitation before I accept food from someone new. These aren't wounds exactly. More like the body's insistence on remembering what the mind is trying to file away. I don't fight them. I just let them be what they are and keep moving. Mark planted tomatoes in the backyard that spring. He's not a gardener, never has been, but he got it into his head that Noah should grow up watching things grow, and so now we have a small raised bed against the fence that is producing more cherry tomatoes than any 3 people could reasonably eat. Noah stands at the edge of it and points at the plants with the seriousness of a person who has opinions about horticulture. Mark crouches next to him and names things. I watch from the porch with my coffee and think about how much of a good life is just this, ordinary and persistent and stubbornly itself. People sometimes say that betrayal changes you. I think that's true, but not always in the way they mean it. It changed what I look for, and when. It changed my threshold for what I call a close friendship now versus a comfortable habit. But it didn't change what I believe in, which is that most people are not Claire. Most people who show up at your door with something kind in their hands are exactly what they appear to be. I'm not going to let one person rewrite everyone else. That would be the second crime, and I'm not willing to let her have it. The first day, Noah said "Mama" clearly, no ambiguity, looking right at me. I was standing at the kitchen counter, and it stopped me so completely I just stood there for a second, not breathing. Mark heard it from the living room and came in fast to see if he'd missed it. I told him yes, and he looked at Noah with an expression I don't have words for. And Noah, completely unbothered by the weight of the moment, went back to banging his spoon on the high chair tray. That's the thing about children. They don't carry the architecture of what almost happened. They only live in what is. I try to learn from that. Some days I'm better at it than others. What I know, what I keep coming back to, is that I'm here. My son is here, my husband is here. The people who love us without agenda or condition are still standing close, and the one who wasn't is somewhere she can't reach us. We didn't just outlast what she tried to do. We kept building. That's not nothing. In fact, I think that might be everything.